Mum, if that's impossible. I just saw Richard on my ship, boarding as a passenger. He's right in front of me, yet you say he's at home. That phone call from my daughter shattered the quiet morning of my life. And if you're hearing this story, I want you to stop for a second. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It matters to me to know how far this story of betrayal and truth will travel. My name is Mave, I am 62 years old, and after years of solitude as a widow, I remarried a man named Richard. My daughter Eleanor, Ellie for short, is 34 and she is no ordinary woman. She is a captain of a passenger ship, sailing across seas and continents. She calls me whenever she can from distant ports, her voice like a lighthouse cutting through the fog of my daily routine. That morning began like any other. I had been watering my plants by the kitchen window, watching the street lamps fade in the rising sun. Richard had gone upstairs after breakfast, saying he wanted a shower before heading to a meeting in the city. His footsteps had creaked on the old staircase, the water had started to run, and I had gone about tidying up the dishes, humming to myself. Then the phone rang. It was Ellie. Her voice was bright at first, full of energy the way only a sailor who commands the waves could sound. "Mom, I'm just checking in before departure. We're about to leave port." I smiled, feeling that warmth in my chest only a mother knows. We talked about Sophie, my granddaughter, and how school was treating her. I was just about to hang up when her tone changed, like a sudden storm rolling over calm water. "Mom," she whispered, "there's something strange happening. I don't even know how to tell you this." My grip on the receiver tightened. "What is it, honey?" Her words came out in a rush. "I just saw Richard. Your husband. Here. On this ship. In the passenger lounge. I saw him hand over his passport to the steward. He's traveling under his real name. And I'm looking at him right now." For a moment I laughed nervously. "Darling, that's impossible. Richard is upstairs. I can hear the shower running." But Ellie didn't laugh. Her voice was grave, quiet, like the hush before a thunderclap. "Mom, I'm not mistaken. He looked me in the eye when he boarded. And I have his passport in my hands." At that very moment the water upstairs stopped. The sound of footsteps echoed down the staircase. Richard's deep voice called out casually, "Mave, who's on the phone?" My stomach twisted. How could this be? One man in two places at once. I covered the receiver with my hand and forced my voice to stay steady. "Just a friend," I answered, stepping quickly into the living room out of his sight. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I whispered into the phone, "Ellie, are you absolutely sure?" Her voice cut through like a blade. "Mom, I'm a captain. I'm trained to observe details. And I'm telling you, I'm staring at Richard on this ship heading across the Atlantic. He's not at your house. He can't be." The line went silent for a long moment, just the faint crackle of distance between us. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Behind me, Richard descended the stairs, his hair damp, his shirt freshly changed, a faint smile on his lips. "Was that Eleanor? How is she?" he asked casually, as if nothing were wrong, as if my world hadn't just cracked open. I forced a weak smile. "She's fine," I said, though my throat was dry. But inside me, waves of fear and doubt collided. If Richard was on Ellie's ship, then who was standing in my living room? I could have dismissed Eleanor's words as stress or fatigue from her work at sea. But the image of my daughter's voice trembling, swearing that she was looking directly at Richard on her ship, would not leave my mind. At first I tried to pretend nothing had changed. Richard moved around the house with his usual charm, smiling, asking about dinner, humming a tune as he polished his shoes. Yet the more I watched, the more the seams began to show. One afternoon I noticed him jotting a note on the grocery list. His handwriting was crisp and slanted, written with his right hand. But the very next morning as I passed through the dining room, I saw him scribbling numbers in a small ledger, this time with his left hand, clumsy and uneven. I stood there frozen, my breath caught in my throat. "Since when do you write with your left hand, Richard?" I asked carefully. He looked up, startled, then forced a laugh. "Oh, just keeping my mind sharp, darling. Ambidexterity is a good skill, isn't it?" He turned the page quickly as if to hide the uneven letters, but not before I caught sight of them, crooked, unsure, like the hand of a stranger. I tried to brush it off, but the unease grew heavier. My granddaughter Sophie had a way of noticing things that adults often ignored. One evening she was drawing at the table while Richard read the newspaper. She looked up at me and whispered, "Grandma, sometimes Grandpa sings to me at bedtime. But other times he doesn't even remember the song." I bent down beside her. "What song, sweetheart?" She smiled. "The one you always sing, Mariner's Lullaby. Grandpa knew it last week, but yesterday he said he'd never heard of it." I felt my chest tighten. That lullaby was ours, a family song I'd sung to both my children when they were small. Richard had learned it only because I taught him, and he had laughed about how simple it was. How could he have forgotten? Sophie tilted her head, her little brow furrowed. "Grandma, is Grandpa playing a game with me?" I kissed her forehead, forcing a smile. "Something like that, darling." But inside, my doubts roared like crashing waves. A few days later, my neighbor Clara came over with a basket of bread. She was a sharp woman, the kind who missed nothing. She set the basket on the table, leaned in and lowered her voice. "Mave, don't think I'm prying, but has Richard been feeling well?" I blinked. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated. "Because yesterday I saw him on the street. He walked right past me without a word. Didn't even recognize me. But this morning when I greeted him at the gate, he smiled and asked about my roses like he always does. To Richard's, Mave. That's how it felt." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I thanked her, tried to brush it off, but after she left, I leaned against the doorframe, trembling. Even Clara had noticed. This wasn't just in my head. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I pulled an old leather notebook from my dresser. My hands shook as I wrote the first entry. Monday, 10 a.m. Richard writes with right hand, neat letters. Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. Richard writes with left hand, crooked. I closed the notebook, pressing it to my chest as if it were a lifeline. The next day I added more. Wednesday, dinner. Richard calls Sophie Pumpkin, his usual nickname. Thursday, breakfast, calls her Sweet Pea, a name he has never used before. Each note felt like another stone added to the anchor pulling me down. By the end of the week, the notebook was filling with contradictions. His changing tone, his sudden bursts of kindness followed by cold silence. The way his gait seemed heavier one day and light the next. And always, the echo of Eleanor's voice in my ears. "Mom, I'm staring at him. He's on my ship." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, the moonlight casting pale stripes across the floor, my notebook open on my lap. The entries stared back at me like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. I whispered to myself, if Richard is here, then who is the man on that ship? And if Richard is there, who have I been living with? The waves outside my window seemed to answer with a single truth. The tide was turning and I could no longer ignore it. By the time another week passed, my notebook was thick with contradictions. The more I wrote, the heavier the weight on my chest became. I could no longer silence the storm inside me. One Friday afternoon, Richard kissed me lightly on the cheek and said, "I'm heading to the market. Won't be long." He picked up his worn leather briefcase and stepped out of the gate with his usual charm. But something in me snapped. "Follow him, Mave," a voice whispered inside my head. "Stop pretending. Find the truth." I grabbed my shawl, pulled it tight around my shoulders and slipped into the street a few minutes after him. My heart pounded so loud I feared he would hear it. Richard walked briskly, but instead of turning right toward the busy market street, he headed left, toward the old port. The air grew salter, heavier as I trailed behind at a careful distance. My shoes clicked softly against the cobblestones, each sound like a drumbeat echoing my fear. Past the fish stalls, past the taverns where sailors shouted over mugs of ale, he kept going until the streets grew quieter. He finally stopped in front of a weathered warehouse with peeling paint and rusted hinges. I ducked behind a stack of fishing nets, my breath shallow. Richard glanced around, then knocked twice on the wooden door. It creaked open and he slipped inside. A minute later, the door opened again. I nearly gasped aloud. Another man, his frame, his face, his very stance, was identical to Richard's. He stepped into the faint light of the alley, pulling a cigarette from his pocket. His expression was harder, colder, his movements heavier. But it was him. The same man. And yet not. I pressed a hand to my mouth to stifle a cry. Two Richards. Or one Richard and a shadow I couldn't name. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the nets, my heart slamming in my chest. I couldn't bear to watch longer, not that night. I turned and walked quickly home, every step heavier, the notebook in my purse feeling like a stone. Inside, the house looked just as it always did. The curtains swayed gently in the breeze, Sophie's crayons were scattered across the table, and the smell of dried lavender drifted from the shelf. Everything looked normal. But nothing was normal anymore. By the time Richard returned, carrying a bag of fish and vegetables, my legs had gone weak. He set the bag on the table, smiling casually. "Darling, the market was busy. I got the best catch of the day." I forced myself to nod, though my throat was dry. I stared at the glistening fish in the bag, wondering if his hands had even touched the market stalls at all. That night, while Richard snored softly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The moonlight crept across the plaster, turning the room silver. Ellie's voice echoed in my mind. "Mom, I'm staring at him. He's on my ship." Clara's warning repeated. 2 Richards, that's how it felt. And now my own eyes had seen it. 2 figures, mirror images, one stepping into the warehouse, the other stepping out. The sea outside roared faintly in the distance as if mocking me. I whispered to myself, what if he isn't who I think he is? What if I've been living with a stranger all along? I pulled the notebook from my nightstand and wrote in shaky letters. Friday 4 p.m. followed Richard. Entered Old Port Warehouse. Another man identical stepped out. The pen nearly slipped from my trembling hand. I closed the notebook, pressed it to my chest and prayed for morning light. The following morning I could no longer sit still. The image of that warehouse at the port haunted me. The peeling paint, the rusted hinges, and the man who looked exactly like my husband. After Richard left for work, I wrapped my shawl tight around me and set out for the port. The sea breeze whipped against my face, bringing the smell of salt and rust, but I pushed forward, determined. The warehouse loomed like a skeleton on the docks, its windows broken, its doors sagging. I hesitated only a moment before knocking. The door creaked open. And there he stood. The man I had seen the day before. Richard's double. His hair was a little longer, his jaw unshaven, his eyes sharper. For a heartbeat I couldn't breathe. My voice cracked as I whispered, "Who are you?" He stiffened, then sighed, shoulders slumping. "So, he didn't tell you." I clutched the edge of the doorway. "Tell me what? Why do you look exactly like my husband?" He looked at me for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. You deserve the truth." Inside, the warehouse was dim, lit only by sunlight slipping through cracks in the roof. Crates were stacked high, the smell of oil and seawater thick in the air. The man pulled up a chair for me, then sat across with a heaviness in his shoulders. "My name is Edgar," he said at last. "Richard is my twin brother." The words fell like stones into silence. "Twins?" I whispered, shaking my head. He never said a word. "He wouldn't," Edgar replied bitterly. "He was always the golden one, the charming one. I was the shadow. He cut me out of his life years ago. But sometimes," he looked down at his hands, "sometimes he calls me back. He asks me to stand in for him." My heart thudded painfully. "Stand in? What do you mean?" Edgar's jaw tightened. "When he needs to disappear. When he doesn't want his family to ask questions. I show up in his place. I walk your streets, I sit at your table, I pretend. And in return he pays me enough to survive." I gripped my shawl, cold sweat running down my neck. The notebook in my bag suddenly made sense. The handwriting shifts, the mood swings, Sophie's confusion. It hadn't just been Richard. It had been Edgar, wearing his life like a borrowed coat. But why? I demanded, my voice rising despite myself. "Why would he need you to pretend? What is he hiding?" Edgar's eyes flickered, torn between guilt and loyalty. "I don't know everything. He doesn't tell me. But I've seen things." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There's a man he meets. Wealthy, well-dressed. They talk in whispers at the docks. Money changes hands. I've heard the name Charles. That's all I know." The name sliced through me like a blade. Eleanor had sworn she saw Richard on her ship with a man in first class. Was this Charles the same man? I pressed a hand to my mouth. My world spun. Edgar looked away, shame clouding his features. "I never meant to hurt you. I only did what he asked because I have nothing else. I live in the shadows. He promised it would never touch you." I stood slowly, legs trembling. "It has touched me. It's tearing my family apart." Edgar's face softened with something like regret. "Then you must prepare yourself, Mave. Because the storm hasn't even begun." When I returned home that evening, the house looked the same as always. Sophie's laughter floated down the hall, her crayons scattered across the floor. Richard was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, chopping vegetables as if nothing in the world was wrong. He glanced up with his charming smile. "You're just in time for dinner. I thought we'd make stew tonight." I forced myself to smile, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. But inside, I carried Edgar's confession like a secret weight. Richard had an identical twin. One who wore his face, walked in his shoes, and covered for his absences. And somewhere in the shadows, a man named Charles waited, wealthy, elegant, and entangled with my husband's lies. The sea outside whispered through the night, its tide rising with each passing hour. And I knew, just as the tide could not be stopped, neither could the truth. I had spent nights turning in bed, clutching my notebook, my mind circling like a ship caught in whirlpools. Edgar's words haunted me. Richard's twin, the man named Charles, the secret meetings at the docks. It all swirled in my chest until I could no longer bear the silence. It was time to face the storm. I called Eleanor, my captain daughter, and told her, "Come home tomorrow night. Bring the documents from the ship." Her voice on the line was steady but sharp. "Mom, what's going on?" "You'll see soon enough," I whispered. The next evening, I set the table as if it were any ordinary family meal. A white cloth, candles flickering, bowls of stew steaming. My hands trembled as I arranged the plates. Sophie danced around the table in her little dress, unaware of the tidal wave about to crash down on us. Richard came down the stairs in his usual calm way, his smile practiced and easy. "You've outdone yourself, Mave," he said, kissing my cheek. I forced a smile. "We're expecting company." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Moments later, the doorbell rang. Eleanor stepped in, uniform crisp, her presence commanding. And behind her came Edgar, Richard's mirror image. The room froze. Sophie gasped, clinging to my skirt. "Grandma, why are there two grandpas?" Richard's face drained of color. His eyes darted from Edgar to Eleanor, then to me. I gripped the back of my chair to keep from shaking. "Sit down, Richard," I said firmly. "It's time we ended these lies." Eleanor placed a folder on the table with a heavy thud. "Passenger records," she announced. She pulled out a stamped document. "Richard Brooks boarded my ship last week. His passport, his signature. I saw him with my own eyes. And yet Mom swore he was at home." She slid the papers across the table. Richard's lips tightened. "This is madness. Some mistake." But Edgar spoke, his voice low but clear. "It wasn't a mistake. You asked me to cover for you, brother. To live in your house, to play your role while you sailed away with Charles." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Charles? That's the man you were with in first class. Wealthy, elegant. You didn't even try to hide it." Richard slammed his fist on the table, his composure cracking. "Enough. Yes, I went with him. Do you think I wanted this small life forever? Charles offered me a world beyond your narrow walls. Wealth, luxury, freedom." His words cut like blades. Sophie burst into tears, burying her face against me. "Grandma, why is Grandpa so mean?" I held her close, fighting back my own tears. Stephen, my eldest son, had just arrived, drawn by Eleanor's call. He stared at his stepfather with fists clenched. "You lied to all of us. You used Edgar like a mask. And you betrayed this family." Richard sneered. "I owe you nothing. I chose my own path." And with that he stood, grabbed his coat, and stormed out into the night, the door slamming like thunder behind him. Silence followed. Only the soft sobs of Sophie filled the room. For a long moment none of us moved. Then Edgar, still standing awkwardly near the door, spoke softly. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I was desperate. But I'll help you now if you'll let me." I looked at him, the same face as Richard, but eyes full of regret instead of arrogance. I nodded slowly. "You've already started, Edgar. You told us the truth. That's more than Richard ever did." Eleanor sat beside me, her hand warm over mine. "Mom, we'll get through this. Together." Sophie sniffled, then looked up at Edgar with innocent curiosity. "Are you the nice grandpa?" He knelt, tears in his eyes. "I'll try to be." That night, as the candles burned low, I looked around the table, at Eleanor's steady gaze, Edgar's humbled posture, and Sophie's fragile smile returning piece by piece. The storm had broken. Richard was gone, carried away by his own greed. But in the wreckage, something new had surfaced. Truth, painful but cleansing. And as my husband Raphael used to tell me long ago, after every storm, Mave, the sea always calms again. I finally believed him.